Peace and blessings, Pan-African family. As Brother Sam P.K. Collins here. As promised, I am recording a video on the 59th anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X. It is incumbent upon me that I fulfill my innermost desires to record this video, not only in recognition of our noble ancestor, but to clarify some things as it relates to his legacy. And I make this video as a Pan-African nationalist, also known as a universal African nationalist, or Garveyite for short. But I also make this video as a Pan-African federalist, one of the many around the world who are advancing the cause of a politically unified African diaspora, a centralized government by which we, as African people all around the world, block out external forces that are meant to divide us, and in which we consolidate power and influence among one another, in which we create tangible African unity. The federalism part is the system by which I understand that we should facilitate African unity. So I'm speaking to you as a Garveyite and a Pan-African federalist. So with that being said, I'm going to jump right into my comments. I'm not going to take too much time, but only to say that Malcolm X, as I said in my Instagram post earlier today, Malcolm X was not a civil rights leader. Historians or those who write on Wikipedia and whatever else, and even people who speak about these leaders contemporarily, the Malcolm X's and the Marcus Garveys, they often put them under the umbrella of civil rights movements, when in fact these Babas and even the Queen of the Moors, and the other ancestors, male and female, were nationalists. They were proponents of Black African self-determination, meaning the creation of institutions, the creation of separate governments through which we would finally be able to identify ourselves as Africans after being subjugated by American and European forces for so long. So that is a total difference from civil rights, which is the advancement of political rights under the colonizer system. That is what W.E.B. Du Bois advanced. That is what Martin Luther King Jr. advanced. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That is what they advanced throughout. And one can even argue that the precursor to that was emancipation, or like the abolition of enslavement, which is what Frederick Douglass advanced during the 19th century. And that is the cause that to some degree was totally different than repatriation, which is what John B. Russwurm and Martin Delany, his contemporaries, talked about. But I'm making these points to differentiate between civil rights and nationalism. Nationalism being, like I said, self-determination, self-identification as a freed African person, an African person who wants to establish their own government, which is why you had the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, African Communities Leagues, of which Malcolm X's parents were members when they were living in the Midwest. So Malcolm X comes from a legacy of nationalism, and Elijah Muhammad is often credited with being the person who opened Malcolm X's eyes to knowledge itself, but it can be argued, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with Jah. So speaking about Malcolm X, that these seeds were inculcated within his bloodline long before he came into knowledge of self through the Nation of Islam. And that's not to discredit the Nation of Islam. Once again, I am here to lay a foundation and to paint a family tree and a lineage of nationalist thoughts. Nationalist thoughts, once again, in the realm of self-determination. So we have to get that out of the way. Malcolm X was not a civil rights leader. He was talking about self-determination, which brings me to my most important point. If you look at Malcolm X's final years, the years that he was out of the Nation of Islam, those are the most important years that, once again, historians and people who document our history through movies, they often overlook. And I'm speaking directly to the Malcolm X movie that Spike Lee produced. A beautiful film. A beautiful film. One criticism that I have, and I'm not alone in this, the criticism that I have is that there was not enough focus on Malcolm X's Pan-Africanism in his advocacy and pursuit of human rights, which, just like nationalism, is a cause totally different than civil rights. Because when you talk about human rights, you get international, you get to a level that goes well beyond what the United States confines you to. And the human rights struggle, as they call it, is one that indicts the United States for crimes against humanity, and it forces and continues to force the United States to look in the mirror and see itself as hypocrites. And once Malcolm X was no longer confined to the Nation of Islam and he took this fight to the global stage, the United States and the other so-called European American powers, right, that were with them had no chance but to collude around his assassination. And people oftentimes like to shed light on the schisms within the nation as the precursor to its assassination, without understanding that the CIA was following Malcolm X along in his travels throughout the African continent. Once again, going back to the movie, the Malcolm X Spike Lee film, we only focused on the pilgrimage to Mecca. He did not focus on the Africa trips, the trips in which Malcolm X got nearly a dozen African leaders to agree to sign on to a cause by which they were going to take the United States before the United Nations for human rights abuses. Once again, when you talk about human rights, you're talking about a free life, access to food, clothing, and shelter, things that Africans in America were not allowed to have and were blocked from or giving the lesser quality of, and something that we continue to suffer from as a collective to this day. The human rights struggle, as they call it, is one that Malcolm X took to the world stage, and that's why he got killed. Another important point as it relates to Malcolm X and him, his nationalism, and just this and just the misinformation around his legacy, we also have to talk about his observer status in the OAU, the Organization of African Unity, the intergovernmental organization that was formed in the wake of the African independence movement, starting with Ghana, so forth and so on. So just as African nations were realizing their nominal independence, because they're not independent just yet, this gets to my last point in this presentation. Just as they were getting around to nominal independence, Malcolm X too was on a pursuit of independence for the Black nation, the nation that would later be identified as New Africans. So because Black America, or New Africans, right, as they would later be called, were not a nation nominally, Malcolm X vied for observer status in the Organization of African Unity, and he got it. He got it as the founding member of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. He formed that before obtaining observer status. So with observer status, he did not have a vote, but he was allowed to listen in on the deliberations that took place. And another important fact is that the observer status allowed Malcolm X, as well as the leaders of other liberation movements around the world, to vie for resources from the AU that would allow them to advance their causes on the ground as they fought for liberation. Because at that time, around 64, 65, you still had numerous African colonies or European colonies on the African continent in which Africans were still fighting for self-determination. So the OAU, as it was called, as it was growing, was still fighting to free those people in those nations. But Malcolm X elevated Black America as a nation within the nation, and going back to Martin Delany, this is what he said in the 19th century, which made him totally different from Frederick Douglass. So I'm saying all of that because in turning to the AU, the OAU, which was later called the African Union, Its formation itself is a big story. And in speaking about African unity and self-determination, a big reason why, even with these newly freed countries, as they're called it, and even with the advances made by Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and several others, why we still find ourselves in this situation is because there's a lack of functional unity. And many of these states are neo-colonial states, meaning that even though they are not under direct colonial control, their former colonizers still have access to their resources, have access to their economic systems, and they manipulate those systems by way of multinational corporations that siphon natural resources from the country, all with the permission of neo-colonial leaders that they install. Because the Kwame Nkrumahs, the Patrice Lumumbas, for example, even the William Tolberts of Liberia, all of these men were killed or exiled, forced into exile by their colleagues with the same skin color as them who were acting on behalf of external powers. So you might look at it as black on black crime, and people may be quick to blame one another. But just like with the Malcolm X Nation of Islam example, if you take a wider lens, you see that the United States and Europe are playing puppet masters in destroying African nations and destroying African people who identify with their own nation outside of the colonizer paradigm. So I say all of that to advance this cause that we are trotting along, which is Pan-African federalism. And one can argue that Malcolm X was one of the first Pan-African federalists, him along with Kwame Nkrumah, who petitioned and agitated among African leaders for a United States of Africa, where it wouldn't just be individual countries, but those countries would become states under a central government. And the system of federalism has been along for a very long time. Indigenous nations in the United States practiced it. Even pre-colonial African societies had federalist systems where you had different kingdoms uniting under an umbrella, and all of that with the goal of uniting resources or sharing resources and even keeping out external forces. There's a reason why we have to unite politically, because it's all about making sure that there's a mutuality in the use of resources, and that we can once again rise as an African people, and more importantly, kick out the external forces. And Pan-African federalism is a movement that is grassroots rather than coming from the top, because at this point, all of these governments are all neo-colonial governments. So even though, we have the Congressional Black Caucus and we have African leaders, black people or people of color, if you're Arab or whatever, who look just like us, they are still beholden to multinational corporations. They're beholden to banks, and they're beholden to NATO and the EU and the UN and other forces that are not acting in the best interest of the African working class globally, which is why any movement from this point forward has to be grassroots. So my goal in giving you this information and talking about Malcolm X is to give you an understanding of his true legacy, and for us as a collective to undo the centuries of brainwashing, or in our case, the years and decades of brainwashing that we have received by being born in a system where we celebrate civil rights gains and quote unquote black excellence more so than self-determination and actual nominal freedom, because that is what Malcolm X represented. And anytime you hear somebody classify him as a civil rights activist, you have to correct them and let them know that he agitated for human rights as a diplomat for Black America and as a nationalist. So I leave you with this. Pan-Africanism is the concept through which we unite as an African people. Federalism is the how, okay? It is the how. We're talking about one government with states, and even the African diaspora being realized as a state in itself, where you have one passport, one currency, and whatever else that we can make under a Pan-African federation. And how that goal will be realized will happen through a series of congresses that we will achieve once we reach a critical mass in the grassroots for support around this idea. Because right now we are focused more so on the problem than the actual symptoms of the problem. We focus on hunger, we focus on high rent, we focus on the criminal justice system. We focus on the breakdown of African families by way of child protective services, but we are not focused on the symptoms of the problem, which is neo-colonialism, which once again is the control of our resources by external forces who keep us fighting for scraps. So instead of fighting for scraps, why not unite as one and be self-determined in that way to create our own systems? I leave you with that. Sante Sana, and much more, much more to the fight. It's always going to be a fight, but it's a fight that we can win. Be self-determined, read up on Malcolm X, celebrate his legacy, give thanks.